Hey guys, so as you know, I'm not the best player and I don't make the most min-maxed builds, so I'm not even competing with those who make the most meta builds, and instead I'm trying to find a different angle. And this time I wanted to play Berserker, and in the past every time I played Berserker and every time I took aspect of the carnage, the build would always feel like a wet toilet paper. It was just squishy every single time. So I wanted to make a bit tankier version of Berserker, using one hand weapon and a shield and having decent life, focusing a bit more on fortify and fortify effect to make me tankier. And then I wanted to play with Wild Strike. But for some reason I keep using Rebuke of the Vaal. And this is the 4th time I'm using Rebuke of the Vaal. It does go to 1000 DPS, so it does sound appealing to use it. And because Wild Strike converts the physical damage into random element, it does work well for this build. The only issue with Rebuke is that it has low base crit chance. So in fact I decided to go non-crit, using Elemental Overload instead. It does have some advantages that a crit build would not have. But of course crit builds can achieve higher DPS numbers. But like I said, I wanted to just be tankier Berserker. I didn't really care too much about the damage. But despite that, I think this build can still pull like 2 million Shaper DPS. I'm not entirely sure about my DPS numbers because Path of Building does not properly calculate multi-strike. But even if it's only 1.5 million DPS, it's still plenty to do the Shaper. And the non-crit build usually has more passive points to spend on defensive nodes. Another thing I wanted to test, and I think it could be interesting for you, is to see how good Wild Strike is for the clear speed without using explosions like Impulsa or Herald of Ice. So those were my goals for this build. So how is the build? And in the end I think I don't really have anything to complain about this build. It's not the highest damage, it's not the tankiest, it's not the fastest. It does have drawbacks, but it's not mostly for the build but mostly because of how the game works. Like for example, getting rage stacks. It is pretty slow on itself, and it is pretty annoying if you need to weapon swap and use like chain hook linked with rage and fast attacking weapon just to get rage faster, which I was not doing because that's too much of a trouble for me. If you are, let's say, fighting Uber Elder and you die, you need to ramp up your rage stacks again, and when you take the Ascendancy node to triple the effect of rage, getting 50 rage stacks does give you a lot of DPS. And until you get 50 rage stacks, your damage is significantly lower. And that is another reason why I wanted to build a bit tankier build, so I wouldn't die and wouldn't lose the rage stacks. But some bosses have really annoying phases, like Shaper for example. If I go into the Shaper fight with 50 rage stacks, by the time Shaper finishes talking, you're already down to below 25 rage stacks, which means you lost about 30% of your DPS. Another thing about Wild Strike, and I think it is important to mention, for the most part I was not using always attack in place, because if you're not hitting anything, then you're not proccing the secondary effects, and sometimes I would just end up swinging my sword next to enemy face without doing anything. So if you're gonna be playing with Wild Strike, experiment to see what you prefer. Another thing to note about Wild Strike, the secondary effects are not melee attacks. So anything that would scale melee, for example melee critical strike multiplier, melee critical strike chance, would not affect it. Some support gems would also not affect it, like Rootless. Rootless would only affect the initial hit, but elemental damage with attacks does affect both initial hit and secondary effects. Also, Wild Strike does have pretty good base damage multiplier, so it does work pretty well with flat added damage to attacks. And this is one of the reasons why Rebuke of the Vaal is most likely much better than multi-modded pure phase DPS weapon, since it is easier and cheaper to get more DPS if it's a mix of physical plus elemental rather than pure physical one. And if you don't believe, you can test this. I will include Path of Building import code with my build and try to replace Rebuke of the Vaal with perfect 600 plus physical DPS Rapier, which would cost you over 40 exalts, or for 13 exalts you can buy over 800 DPS foil, and then you would still have less DPS. I feel like people do not realize how powerful Rebuke of the Vaal is, or maybe just because it's not elemental meta and people are doing pure physical builds. Well, you can't really do pure physical build with Wild Strike, because Wild Strike converts 100% of physical damage into random element, and there is no way to influence that randomness. And because you cannot influence this randomness, elemental equilibrium is just not worth it. Which also means if you use elemental equilibrium and you have some flat elemental damage to attack somewhere, it would completely screw up elemental equilibrium, because Wild Strike, unlike elemental hit, does not disable other elements. And I think I mentioned everything that I wanted to mention about Wild Strike. In the end, I think this build feels pretty decent. Wild Strike itself with Ancestral Call does a good job at clear speed. It does have quite a lot of conditional things like triggering elemental overload, but it is not really an issue. And bossing is also not an issue, at least for mapping. Legion could be an issue because, like I said, you are taking increased damage because aspect of carnage. And the Shaper was only annoying because I lost half of my rage stacks. So in the end, I would say this build was a success. Next, I'm gonna go over my items, skills, links, passive skill tree, but if you don't have time to listen to the rest of the video, just check path for building import code in video description. So the items, I decided to use Shroud of the Lightless because I wanted extra penetration, and actually there is a trick. It's not really difficult to get 4 of colors like this, because if you check your bench craft, where is it? You can only craft 5 sockets, which only cost 70 jewelers. So you can do roll 2 green. You can roll 2 reds. 2 reds. It's gonna be first 2 reds, then roll 2 sockets, then roll 3 sockets, 2 sockets, 3 sockets until you get a fed red. Then roll 4 sockets, 3 sockets, 4 sockets, 3 sockets, 4 sockets until you roll the 4th red, and then just use 5 sockets, and you either gonna get blue or green. Or if you have bad luck like me, you're gonna get a 5th red one and gonna have to do it again. But that's probably the cheapest way to do this method. So like I said, I wanted more penetration because I'm using all the elements, and this is a cheap option. You don't need worry about 6 linking. You also get increased life per abyss jewel affecting you. So I'm also stacking quite few abyss jewels. I'm gonna show you that later. And my Wild Strike is currently linked with multi-strike, fortify, elemental damage of attacks, and then ancestral call for the clear speed, which I do swap to rage if I'm fighting a boss where I cannot get rage before the boss fight. But if I have 50 rage stacks, then instead I do swap to rootless. Rootless, like I said, only affects the initial hit. Next, this sword is 953 DPS. I think it costed about 25 years only. Then I crafted a shield with physical damage reduction, decent life, some resistances. Actually, I needed quite a lot more resistances. The helmet from some previous build, oh yeah, from the dual strike build, -9 cold and -9 lightning resistance to nearby enemies. But the highest damage number is from the cold because I'm also using hatred. You may have noticed I am finally using my favorite gloves, Fenumus Weave, because there was simply nothing else that I could use as my aura that would benefit me more. And besides, I wanted to slow enemies down a bit more, so that's a good option. And besides, they are very cheap now. Belt just with elemental damage of attacks, and you do want to get elemental damage of attacks anywhere you can because you're already getting a lot of flare damage, so you want to multiply that flare damage. And getting flare damage is not as effective as getting elemental damage of attacks or attack speed, so focus on those two. Mark of the Elder does give a lot of damage if your second ring is shaped. The issue is that I needed total mana cost of skills and I don't have that bench craft. So if you can get a decent shaped ring with elemental damage of attacks and crafted minus total mana cost of skills, definitely do that. The amulet damage penetration, it doesn't have to be elemental penetration. It can be elemental damage of attacks, attack speed. Don't need to worry about accuracy, just get decent life, maybe resistance, maybe dex actually. Yeah, I actually needed dexterity. Next, boots. Some random boots, and instead of worrying about getting onslaught on kill on abyss jewels, I just crafted these since I am moving mostly with the leap slam and I don't really run too much. So the movement speed doesn't matter too much. And next, for the flasks, very simple. My traditional setup, 2 life flasks, just in case one is not enough. Sulfur flask, and then Atziri's Promise, because you are converting some physical damage into elemental damage, so it is pretty big damage multiplier. Now the other links. So I am using low level precision. You don't need very high level one. I'm gonna actually show you later how I solve my accuracy. Then I do have Blood Rage. Quality does give an extra 5% increased attack speed, so if you can get Clarity, do get that. Orb of Storm, Curse on hit, increased critical strike chance, and then Elemental Weakness. And because Orb of Storms procs an additional times if you use a lighting skill inside its AoE. And Wild Strike does have all the tags, fire, cold and lighting. So when you're using Lightning Strike, you also supposed to proc more Orb of Storms, and Orb of Storms helps you proc Elemental Overload. Since this build is not a crit and it's really annoying to trigger Elemental Overload while using Multi-Strike just with your attacks, even if you have, let's see, even if you have barely 10% crit chance. Next, cast with damage taken, Wave of Conviction and Immortal Call. Now, Wave of Conviction is another thing that I was kind of mistaken in the past, but I feel like this is a bug. According to Wiki, you can apply both exposures, fire and lighting at the same time, because you are hitting for equal amount of damage. I don't want to go too deep into that, but turns out against enemies it is kind of random, either fire or lighting exposure. But in my case, since I do have Hatred, I am applying cold exposure, or at least I should be, unless I'm wrong about that as well. But as you can see, the cold damage is the highest, so I should be applying cold exposure. In my boots I have Hatred, Ruthless for swap, I do have Maim and Vaal Ancestral Warchief. Maim is not important, I only added it because, well, why not? It slows enemies down, may help me a bit. In my gloves I have Ancestral Protector, Leaf Slam, Combustion, another conditional thing, and faster attacks to leave slam faster. But until you get 50 rage stacks, the speed may feel slow, but don't be misled by this. Trust me, once you get 50 rage stacks and you get this node, you're gonna be so much faster, and the build only started feel, I guess, satisfying at around level 50 something, and it wasn't very pleasant until then. So for bossing setup, I usually just go to the boss with the Blood Rage on, drop Orb of Storms, drop my totems, and then flask, and then just DPS. Yeah, on the visuals you want flat life, and then elemental damage to attacks, but not physical. Elemental damage to attacks gives you more, and then whatever you can get, maybe blind on hit, maybe onslaught on hit if you want, maybe conditional attack speed if you have crit recently. Also Watcher's Eye, added flat cold damage while affected by hatred. Oh, how I fix my accuracy. If you use Tempered Mind in here, for example, in this case I am getting 1500 flat accuracy. So actually I have 100% hit chance and even 97% hit chance against evasive monsters. And I'm level 89. The leveling process, I don't know if I can give you a good advice, but I think from the Marauder I went straight up to here to get some damage nodes. This I took much later on, but you can get it earlier. Get Elemental Overload as soon as possible. Like I said, I also focus on getting a bit of Fortify effect, which makes me a bit tankier. I think around 4% reduced damage taken from these nodes extra. Iron Reflex, since I am using this body armor, which is evasion ES, so I convert all the evasion that I have into armor, and I do have 4.2k armor without well, Granite Flask. Actually, you can use Granite Flask if you choose. And that's gonna be all. I'm not entirely sure about my next build. I kinda want to do another minion build. I hope you don't mind that I'm making minion builds so frequently this league, but there are quite a lot of interesting things for minions. So most likely my next build is gonna be another minion build. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.